The wind howled mercilessly across the snow-covered Alaskan landscape, cutting through the thin jacket of 6-year-old Tommy Peterson like 1,000 icy knives. He had wandered away from his father's hunting camp just moments ago, chasing a curious snowshoe hare that darted between the pine trees. Now, disoriented and terrified, Tommy realized he was completely lost. His small boots crunched through the powdery snow, each step becoming more difficult. Tears froze on his cheeks almost instantly, and his fingers were already turning a dangerous shade of blue. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Tommy knew from his father's hunting stories that survival in these conditions was nearly impossible for a child. The forest grew darker, shadows lengthening between the snow-laden spruce trees. Tommy's movements became slower, his steps more uncertain. He was exhausted, cold, and the overwhelming silence of the wilderness pressed against him like a heavy blanket. His bright red jacket, which had seemed so cheerful back at the camp, now blended into the muted greys and whites of the winter landscape. As consciousness began to slip away, Tommy heard a low rumbling sound. Through his blurring vision, a massive dark shape emerged from between the trees, a bear, impossibly large and dark against the white snow. Most children would have screamed, but Tommy was too weak, too cold to do anything but watch as the enormous creature approached. The Alaskan wilderness in mid-December was unforgiving, a landscape of brutal cold and unrelenting wind that could transform a living being into a frozen statue within hours. The temperature had plummeted to negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill factors making it feel closer to negative 50. These were conditions that even experienced wilderness survivors feared and respected. John Peterson, Tommy's father, was an experienced wilderness guide and hunter who had spent decades navigating these treacherous terrains. When he first realized Tommy was missing, his professional training immediately kicked in. He knew every minute counted in these temperatures. Hypothermia could set in within 10, 15 minutes of exposure, and frostbite could permanently damage exposed skin in mere moments. The search and rescue team was mobilized quickly. Local park rangers, volunteer wilderness experts, and state troopers assembled with specialized equipment: thermal imaging cameras, GPS tracking devices, snowmobiles, and emergency medical gear. They understood the slim chances of finding a 6-year-old child alive in such extreme conditions. Tracking was difficult. Fresh snowfall had begun, gradually covering any potential tracks Tommy might have left. The landscape was a blank white canvas, erasing evidence with each passing hour. Visibility was reduced to mere meters, making aerial searches nearly impossible. Ground teams moved systematically, calling Tommy's name, listening for any response. John Peterson was a man transformed. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced by a desperate primal energy. He knew these woods better than anyone. Every trail, every hidden valley, every potential shelter. He understood how a child might think, where they might wander, what landmarks might catch their attention. His knowledge was both a blessing and a curse, giving him hope while simultaneously showing him the harsh statistical probabilities. The local Inuit community also joined the search. Elders who had lived in these regions for generations brought traditional tracking skills passed down through centuries. They understood the wilderness in a way modern technology could never replicate, reading snow patterns, interpreting animal tracks, sensing subtle environmental changes that might indicate human presence. As night approached, the temperature continued to drop. Search teams knew that each hour reduced Tommy's survival chances exponentially. Hypothermia would first cause uncontrollable shivering, then confusion, then gradual shutdown of critical bodily functions. A child as young as Tommy would be particularly vulnerable. Sophisticated thermal imaging equipment scanned the landscape looking for any heat signature. Snowmobiles with specialized tracking equipment moved in coordinated patterns, covering ground quickly. Helicopter teams waited on standby, ready to deploy if any promising signal was detected. But nobody, not the professional rescuers, not the experienced wilderness guides, not even Tommy's own father, could have predicted the extraordinary event about to unfold in those frozen woods. Something was happening that defied all conventional understanding of survival. something that would become a legend, whispered around campfires for years to come. The wilderness held its breath, waiting. In the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, where survival was a daily battle against nature's most unforgiving elements, an extraordinary encounter was about to unfold. A massive Kodiak brown bear, typically a creature feared for its predatory instincts, would become an unlikely savior. The bear, a mature male weighing nearly 1,200 pounds, had been foraging for the last remnants of food before the deep winter hibernation. Most bears would have already been deep in their winter dens, but this particular bear was different. Something had kept him alert, moving through the snow-covered landscape with an unusual sense of purpose. Tommy had wandered far from his father's hunting camp, a curious 6-year-old who had momentarily been distracted by a flutter of movement, perhaps a snow rabbit or a distant bird. Children that young have no real concept of danger, especially in wilderness terrain. What seemed like a momentary exploration quickly became a life-threatening situation as the temperature continued to plummet and darkness began to settle. The boy was dressed in layers, a thick winter coat, insulated snow pants, boots, and gloves. But these were rapidly becoming inadequate against the brutal Alaskan winter. His body temperature was dropping rapidly. The initial warmth from his movement had given way to an intense, bone-chilling cold that was slowly paralyzing his young body. When the bear first spotted Tommy, it wasn't with the predatory gaze one might expect. Something in the child's vulnerable position, huddled against a small rock formation, shivering uncontrollably, triggered a different response. Bears, contrary to their fearsome reputation, are complex creatures with remarkable emotional intelligence. This particular bear had lost its own cubs the previous spring to a territorial conflict. The maternal instinct, or perhaps something deeper and more inexplicable, seemed to activate. Instead of approaching Tommy as potential prey, the bear moved with a deliberate, almost protective stance. As Tommy's consciousness began to fade, the bear approached. His massive paws, each capable of crushing a human skull, now moved with surprising gentleness. He positioned his enormous body around the child, creating a living windbreak. The bear's internal body temperature, significantly warmer than the surrounding environment, began to transfer heat to Tommy's rapidly cooling body. The bear's thick fur, designed to withstand Arctic temperatures, became a literal lifeline. He curled around Tommy, blocking the wind, sharing body heat in a way that defied all conventional understanding of predator-prey relationships. It was as if some primordial instinct of protection had overridden the bear's natural hunting behaviors. Hours passed. The search parties continued their desperate hunt, unaware that the child they sought was being protected by the very creature most would consider a mortal threat. The bear remained vigilant, occasionally shifting position to maintain optimal heat transfer, watching the surrounding wilderness with keen senses. As dawn approached and the first light began to break through the heavy snow clouds, the bear's protective stance remained unchanged. Tommy, barely conscious but alive, was breathing, shallow but steady, wrapped in the most unexpected of survival mechanisms. The wilderness, which moments before had seemed a death sentence, had become a stage for one of the most remarkable rescue stories that would ever be told. A story of survival that would challenge everything people understood about the natural world, about predation, about the mysterious connections that exist between species. Little did anyone know that this moment would be the first thread in a complex tapestry of connection that would span decades, linking the bear, Tommy, and a future neither could possibly anticipate. The rescue that followed Tommy's miraculous survival became the stuff of local legend in the small Alaskan community. Search and rescue teams, who had been combing the wilderness for days, were stunned when they discovered the child not just alive, but relatively unharmed. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead physician at the regional hospital in Anchorage, would later describe Tommy's condition as nothing short of medical marvel. When the boy was brought in, his core body temperature had dropped to 82 degrees Fahrenheit, a level typically associated with severe hypothermia and near certain death. Most medical professionals would have considered his survival impossible.
In my 25 years of emergency medicine,
Dr. Rodriguez would later tell medical journals,
I've never seen a case quite like Tommy's. The physiological markers suggested he should have suffered catastrophic organ damage, if not complete system failure.
The initial medical examination revealed a series of extraordinary circumstances. Despite hours of exposure to temperatures that would typically kill an adult, let alone a child, Tommy showed remarkably minimal tissue damage. His fingers and toes, which should have been prime candidates for frostbite, were largely intact. The medical team was baffled. Tommy's father, Jack Harrison, a seasoned wilderness guide with over 3 decades of experience in Alaska's most challenging terrains, could barely comprehend what had happened. His initial search had been frantic, driven by the gut-wrenching fear that every parent experiences when a child goes missing in such unforgiving conditions.
I've seen bears take down moose from 100 yards.
Jack would later recount in interviews.
The idea that a bear, the same creature I've spent my entire career avoiding and respecting as a potential threat, would actually save my son? It defied everything I knew about wilderness survival.
The physical recovery was just the beginning of Tommy's journey. The psychological impact of his experience would prove equally complex. Child psychologists brought in to evaluate Tommy discovered something extraordinary. Unlike most children who experience near-death trauma, Tommy showed no signs of typical stress responses. Dr. Michael Chen, a child trauma specialist from the University of Washington, conducted extensive interviews and psychological assessments.
Tommy's narrative was unique.
Dr. Chen noted in his professional report.
He spoke about the bear not as a terrifying creature, but almost like a guardian. His description suggested a level of connection that went beyond simple survival instinct.
The local Native Alaskan community, with their deep spiritual connection to wildlife, had a different perspective. Elders spoke of ancient stories about spirit animals and protective encounters with wilderness creatures. While the medical community approached Tommy's story scientifically, the indigenous perspective offered a more mystical interpretation. Tommy's physical rehabilitation became a meticulous process. Despite the minimal damage, doctors were concerned about potential long-term effects of such extreme hypothermia. Regular checkups, blood tests, and neurological evaluations became a routine part of his childhood. Interestingly, Tommy developed an unusual affinity for wildlife, particularly bears. Where most children might develop a fear after such an encounter, he showed remarkable curiosity and compassion. His bedroom walls were adorned with bear photographs, wildlife books, and drawings that seemed to capture something more than mere childhood fascination. The local media initially treated the story as a sensational miracle. National news outlets picked up the narrative with headlines like,
Miracle in the Wilderness.
and
Bear's unexpected rescue defies medical understanding.
scientific journals requested detailed medical records, hoping to understand the physiological mechanisms that allowed Tommy's survival. Jack Harrison, initially hesitant about media attention, eventually became an advocate for wildlife conservation. The experience transformed his understanding of wilderness dynamics. He began giving lectures about human-wildlife interactions, using Tommy's story as a powerful narrative about the complexity of animal behavior. As years passed, the initial medical mystery surrounding Tommy's survival became a footnote. But for those who knew the full story, it remained a testament to the unpredictable, sometimes inexplicable connections that exist in nature. No one could have predicted how this extraordinary encounter would echo through Tommy's life, setting the stage for a future that was as unexpected as his wilderness rescue. The bear that saved him had disappeared back into the vast Alaskan wilderness, leaving behind a story that would be whispered around campfires, discussed in scientific conferences, and remembered as one of those rare, extraordinary moments where the boundary between survival and miracle became beautifully blurred. Tommy's recovery was a delicate dance of medical intervention and familial support. The Harrison family, traditionally stoic and resilient, found themselves navigating uncharted emotional territories. Jack, a wilderness guide accustomed to managing external challenges, struggled to manage the internal turmoil of his son's near-death experience. His wife, Sarah, became Tommy's primary caregiver, transforming their home into a carefully monitored recovery environment. She consulted multiple specialists, read every medical journal she could find, and developed an almost scientific approach to Tommy's rehabilitation. The medical team was particularly concerned about potential neurological impacts. Regular MRI scans, cognitive assessments, and psychological evaluations became routine. Dr. Rodriguez, who had initially treated Tommy, remained personally invested in his case, scheduling quarterly checkups that went beyond standard medical protocol. Tommy's younger sister, Emma, developed a protective instinct that surprised their parents. She would sit for hours reading to him, helping with his physical therapy exercises and creating elaborate stories about his
Bear adventure.
that seemed to help him process the trauma. The financial strain was significant. Despite Jack's steady income as a wilderness guide, the specialized medical care and ongoing treatments pushed their resources to the limit. Sarah took a part-time job at the local hospital to help cover expenses, creating a complex family dynamic of recovery and resilience. Psychological counseling revealed interesting patterns in Tommy's recovery. He showed remarkable emotional stability, often describing his wilderness experience with a calm that bewildered child psychologists. His attachment to the concept of the bear that saved him became a central theme in his emotional development. Family gatherings became opportunities for Tommy's story to be shared and processed. Relatives would listen intently, each retelling adding layers of complexity to the already extraordinary narrative. Jack's father, a retired park ranger, was particularly fascinated by the medical and wilderness aspects of Tommy's survival. As years passed, the immediate medical crisis transformed into a long-term journey of understanding. Tommy's body showed remarkable adaptability, with no lasting physical complications from his extreme hypothermia experience. His immune system seemed unusually robust, a fact that continued to intrigue medical researchers. The family's approach to Tommy's experience was a careful balance between celebration and caution. They recognized the miracle of his survival, while also protecting him from becoming defined solely by this extraordinary event. Sarah and Jack worked hard to ensure Tommy had a normal childhood, despite the extraordinary circumstances of his early years. By the time Tommy entered his teenage years, the initial medical emergency had become a distant memory. Yet, the experience had fundamentally shaped the Harrison family's dynamics, creating a unique bond that went beyond typical familial connections. The psychological landscape of Tommy's survival was a complex terrain, marked by intricate emotional pathways that defied conventional understanding. From the moment he was found, wrapped in the protective embrace of what seemed like an impossible guardian, a wild bear, Tommy's mental world became a labyrinth of trauma, wonder, and inexplicable resilience. Child psychologist Dr. Elena Martinez and Dr. Robert Thompson, specialists in wilderness trauma and childhood survival experiences, became deeply invested in Tommy's case. Their initial assessments revealed a child who processed his near-death experience with an emotional maturity that was both fascinating and concerning. During early therapy sessions, Tommy would describe the bear with a reverence that transcended typical childhood storytelling.
He wasn't just an animal.
He would say, his eyes distant and reflective.
He was protection.
These statements weren't dramatic or theatrical, but spoken with a matter-of-fact tone that suggested deep psychological integration of the experience. The nightmares were unexpected. Unlike many trauma survivors who experienced terror-filled sleep, Tommy's dreams were strangely peaceful. He would often wake up feeling protected, describing landscapes of snow and wilderness with a sense of comfort that puzzled his therapists. One recurring dream involved a large, shadowy figure moving alongside him through a frozen forest, not threatening, but guardianish. School presented its own set of psychological challenges. Tommy wasn't the typical
Survivor.
narrative. He didn't seek attention or dramatize his experience. Instead, he displayed an unusual calm, a detachment that made him seem older than his years. His classmates oscillated between viewing him as a curiosity and treating him normally. Attachment studies revealed fascinating patterns. Tommy formed deep but selective connections. He was intensely loyal to a small circle, his immediate family, Dr. Martinez, and interestingly, wildlife conservation professionals, who would occasionally visit to discuss his experience. His empathy toward animals, particularly large predators, was pronounced. Cognitive assessments showed no traditional trauma markers. His memory wasn't fragmented or suppressed. Instead, it was remarkably clear. He could recall precise details of his wilderness experience, temperature, landscape features, the bear's movements, with an almost photographic precision that fascinated neurological researchers. The psychological community became quietly intrigued. Tommy's case represented a unique intersection of survival psychology, childhood resilience, and human-wildlife interaction. Academic papers were written, conferences held discussions, and his story became a reference point for understanding extreme survival scenarios. Jack and Sarah Harrison navigated this complex psychological landscape with a mixture of protective instinct and scientific curiosity. They allowed Tommy space to process his experience while ensuring he received professional psychological support. Family therapy became a critical component of their approach, helping all family members understand and integrate this extraordinary event. Interestingly, Tommy developed a profound connection with nature that went beyond typical childhood curiosity. He showed an almost intuitive understanding of wilderness dynamics, animal behavior, and survival techniques. Local wilderness guides and park rangers would later comment on his uncanny ability to read environmental signals. As he entered adolescence, the psychological impact became more nuanced. Tommy wasn't defined by his survival, but was subtly shaped by it. He showed leadership qualities, remained calm under pressure, and displayed an emotional intelligence that seemed beyond his years. His peers respected him, not for his survival story, but for his genuine character. Dr. Martinez, who continued monitoring Tommy's psychological development, noted something remarkable. Rather than being traumatized by his experience, Tommy seemed to have been fundamentally transformed by it. His survival wasn't just a physical miracle, but a profound psychological metamorphosis. The bear, that mysterious, unnamed protector, remained a symbolic figure in Tommy's psychological landscape. Not as a literal animal, but as a representation of unexpected protection, of survival against impossible odds, of a connection that transcended typical human-wildlife boundaries. By his late teenage years, Tommy had integrated his experience into his identity without being consumed by it. He was neither a victim nor a hero, but simply a young man who had experienced something extraordinary and emerged with a unique perspective on survival, protection, and the unpredictable nature of existence. Tommy's childhood unfolded like a delicate tapestry woven with threads of extraordinary survival and remarkable resilience. From the moment he was rescued, his life became a testament to human adaptability and the profound impact of a singular, life-altering experience. The early years were marked by intense medical scrutiny. Doctors marveled at his physical recovery. His body had survived temperatures that would have killed most adults, let alone a small child. Frostbite should have claimed his fingers and toes, yet he emerged with minimal lasting damage. Specialists from Alaska to Boston studied his medical records, creating case studies that would be discussed in medical journals for years to come. At home, the Harrisons approached Tommy's upbringing with a careful balance of normalcy and understanding. They recognized early on that he was not a typical child. While other parents worried about scraped knees and playground disputes, Jack and Sarah navigated the complex terrain of raising a child who had literally danced with death and survived. Elementary school presented unique challenges. Tommy was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. He wasn't the child who constantly retold his survival story, nor was he withdrawn or traumatized. Instead, he possessed a quiet confidence that set him apart. During show and tell, while other children brought toys or family photos, Tommy would sometimes bring intricate drawings of wilderness landscapes, detailed, almost photographic representations that suggested a memory far beyond his years. His relationship with nature became his most defining characteristic. Where most children feared the wilderness, Tommy felt a profound connection. Weekend family camping trips transformed from typical outdoor experiences to educational journeys. Jack would watch in amazement as his son identified animal tracks, understood wind patterns, and seemed to communicate with the environment in a way that defied conventional understanding. School counselors and teachers noted his exceptional emotional intelligence. Tommy displayed an empathy that went beyond typical childhood compassion. During a third-grade incident where a classmate was being bullied, Tommy's intervention was not aggressive or dramatic, but deeply compassionate. He understood vulnerability in a way most children couldn't comprehend. Physical education and outdoor activities became his natural domain. While other children struggled with wilderness survival simulations during school camps, Tommy moved with an innate understanding. His physical coordination suggested muscle memory from an experience most would consider traumatic. Wilderness instructors would later comment that he moved like someone who had been raised in the wild, not in suburban comfort. The Harrison family made a conscious decision to be open about Tommy's experience without sensationalizing it. They protected him from media attention, turning down numerous interview requests and documentary proposals. Instead, they focused on providing him with a stable, loving environment that allowed his unique experiences to integrate naturally into his development. Adolescence brought more complex layers to Tommy's journey. His peers began to understand the magnitude of his survival story, but Tommy remained remarkably grounded. He wasn't interested in being defined by a single event, no matter how extraordinary. Instead, he channeled his experiences into a passionate interest in wildlife conservation and wilderness survival techniques. By middle school, Tommy had developed a reputation as the go-to person for outdoor skills. Scouts, outdoor enthusiasts, and even local park rangers sought his insights. His knowledge wasn't theoretical, it was visceral, born from an experience that defied conventional understanding. He could explain survival techniques with a clarity that suggested he had lived through scenarios most would only read about. His academic performance was equally remarkable. Tommy didn't just excel. He approached learning with a methodical precision that suggested his wilderness experience had rewired his cognitive processes. Mathematics, sciences, and particularly environmental studies became his strengths. Teachers noted his ability to see complex systems, whether ecological or mathematical, with a holistic perspective. Family dynamics evolved around Tommy's unique experience. Jack and Sarah became advocates for wilderness safety and child survival education. They spoke at conferences, not as sensationalists, but as thoughtful parents who had witnessed an extraordinary journey of human resilience. Tommy was always supportive, but never the center of their narrative. Relationships presented their own interesting challenges. Tommy's emotional depth made typical adolescent interactions complex. He wasn't interested in superficial connections. His friends were few but deeply loyal. He seemed to choose companions who demonstrated genuine character, a trait he had learned during his most vulnerable moment in the Alaskan wilderness. As he approached high school, Tommy began to articulate his experience more openly, not as a traumatic event, but as a transformative journey. He started writing, first privately, then in school publications, about human-wildlife interactions, survival psychology, and the profound connections between humans and their environment. His bedroom became a reflection of his journey. Wilderness photographs, detailed maps, survival gear carefully maintained, and bookshelves filled with texts on ecology, psychology, and wilderness survival. It was a space that told a story of a boy who had experienced something most would consider impossible. By 16, Tommy had begun to see his survival not as a singular event, but as part of a larger narrative about human potential, environmental understanding, and the unexpected ways life can transform an individual. He was no longer just a survivor. He was becoming a storyteller, an observer, and a potential bridge between human understanding and wilderness wisdom. The bear that had saved him remained an unspoken presence, not a literal memory, but a symbolic representation of protection, of unexpected salvation, of the profound mysteries that exist beyond human comprehension. The unexpected connection to wilderness. Tommy's connection to the wilderness transcended typical human-nature relationships, evolving into something profound and almost mystical, yet entirely grounded in tangible experiences. As he entered college, Studying environmental science at the University of Alaska, his understanding of his survival story began to take on deeper, more complex dimensions. During his sophomore year, Tommy enrolled in an advanced wilderness research program that would change the trajectory of his understanding. Professor Eleanor Rodriguez, a renowned wildlife behavioral expert, recognized something unique in Tommy's approach to environmental studies. Where other students analyzed data and tracked wildlife patterns, Tommy seemed to possess an intuitive understanding that went beyond academic research. A pivotal moment came during a remote tracking expedition in the same Alaskan wilderness where he had been rescued decades earlier. The research team was studying wolf migration patterns and grizzly bear territories, while other researchers relied solely on GPS tracking and scientific instruments. Tommy demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict animal movements and behaviors. One particularly challenging expedition tested the limits of his connection. The team had been tracking a specific wolf pack for weeks, struggling to understand their complex migration patterns. Tommy's insights began to emerge subtly at first. A suggestion here, an observation there. He would point out subtle landscape changes, minute shifts in terrain that suggested animal movement patterns that seemed almost impossible to detect. Professor Rodriguez initially approached Tommy's insights with academic skepticism, but as their predictions consistently proved accurate, her perspective shifted. During one critical moment, Tommy identified a potential wolf den location that satellite imagery and traditional tracking methods had completely missed. When the team investigated, they discovered not just the den, but a complex ecosystem that provided unprecedented insights into wolf behavior. The wilderness seemed to communicate with Tommy in a language that defied conventional scientific understanding. It wasn't mystical or supernatural. It was a deep, intuitive connection born from his extraordinary survival experience. Researchers began to study Tommy himself, attempting to understand the neurological and psychological mechanisms behind his unique wilderness perception. Neurological studies revealed fascinating results. Brain scans showed heightened neural connectivity in areas associated with spatial awareness and environmental perception. Researchers hypothesized that his near-death experience in the wilderness had fundamentally rewired his cognitive processes, creating a unique form of environmental intelligence. Tommy's reputation grew within academic circles, but he remained humble and focused. He wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity or sensationalizing his experiences. Instead, he saw his connection as a responsibility, a bridge between human understanding and the complex ecosystems that sustained life. His research began to focus on human-wildlife interactions, particularly in extreme environments. He developed innovative conservation strategies that considered both ecological preservation and human survival techniques. His work caught the attention of international wildlife conservation organizations, who saw in him a unique approach to understanding wilderness dynamics. During a critical research expedition in the Brooks Range, Tommy's connection to the wilderness would be tested in ways no one could have anticipated. The team was studying the impact of climate change on alpine ecosystems when a sudden, severe storm threatened their survival. While experienced researchers began to panic, Tommy remained calm, utilizing survival skills that seemed to emerge from a deep, almost cellular memory. He guided the team to a natural shelter, reading the landscape with an expertise that seemed to blend scientific knowledge with an almost primal understanding. They survived not just through technical skills, but through Tommy's profound connection to the environment. Other team members would later describe it as witnessing something beyond traditional survival techniques, a communion with the wilderness itself. Academic papers began to explore Tommy's unique perspective. His research challenged traditional boundaries between human observation and environmental interaction. He proposed radical new frameworks for understanding ecosystem dynamics, suggesting that human perception could be expanded beyond current scientific limitations. Personal relationships remained complex for Tommy. His deep connection to the wilderness often made traditional social interactions challenging. Romantic partners found his intensity and focus difficult to comprehend. He wasn't distant or cold. Rather, He possessed an emotional depth that seemed to draw from his profound wilderness experiences. By his late 20s, Tommy had become a respected environmental researcher and wilderness survival expert. His work bridged multiple disciplines: psychology, environmental science, conservation biology, and human survival techniques. International organizations sought his expertise for complex environmental challenges. The bear that had saved him decades earlier remained an unspoken presence in his life's work. While he never explicitly connected his survival to his current research, those who knew his story understood the profound impact of that singular moment. It wasn't just a rescue, it was the beginning of a lifelong journey of understanding. Tommy's lectures and presentations became legendary in academic circles. He didn't just present data, he told stories that connected human experience with environmental complexity. Students and researchers were drawn not just to his scientific expertise, but to his unique perspective that suggested a deeper, more interconnected understanding of wilderness. As climate change and environmental challenges became increasingly critical global issues, Tommy's work gained even more significance. He wasn't just a researcher, he was a translator, helping humanity understand its complex relationship with the natural world. His journey from a rescued child to a leading environmental expert represented more than personal achievement. It was a testament to human resilience, to the unexpected ways survival can shape understanding, and to the profound connections that exist beyond human comprehension. The wilderness that had once threatened to claim his life had instead become his greatest teacher, his most profound connection, and the foundation of a life dedicated to understanding the complex, beautiful, and often brutal language of nature. Chance encounter years later. The crisp autumn morning in Anchorage seemed unremarkable until the moment Tommy's world collided with an unexpected fragment of his past. He was presenting a research symposium on wilderness conservation when a weathered park ranger approached him after the presentation, his eyes fixed with an intensity that immediately set Tommy on edge.
"I know who you are,"
the ranger said quietly, sliding an old, worn photograph across the table. The image was faded but unmistakable, a young bear standing near a small, half-frozen child in a snow-covered landscape. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. The ranger, named Jack Holloway, was a 65-year-old veteran of Alaska's wilderness preservation efforts. He had been part of the search and rescue team decades earlier, the very team that had found Tommy barely alive after his miraculous survival. What he was about to reveal would change everything Tommy understood about his past.
"The bear that saved you,"
Jack began.
"wasn't just a random animal. It was part of something much larger, a story that has haunted me for decades."
Jack explained that the bear was part of a unique research project, tracking animal behavior in extreme wilderness conditions. What appeared to be a random rescue was actually the result of years of complex environmental and behavioral studies that few people knew about. The photograph contained a detail Tommy had never noticed before: a small tracking collar, barely visible against the bear's fur. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a meticulously documented moment of interspecies interaction that defied conventional understanding. As Jack unfolded the story, Tommy realized his entire life, his career, his connection to the wilderness had been shaped by this single moment decades ago. The bear wasn't just a random animal that had saved him. It was part of a carefully monitored population, part of a scientific study that had been tracking animal behavior in ways nobody had previously understood. The revelation would challenge everything Tommy thought he knew about his survival, about the wilderness, and about the intricate connections between human and animal worlds. Revelation of deeper connection. The next few weeks became a blur of intense research and emotional discovery for Tommy. Jack Holloway's initial revelation was just the tip of an intricate and complex story that would challenge everything Tommy understood about his miraculous survival. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a renowned wildlife biologist who had been part of the original research project, agreed to meet Tommy in her small office at the University of Alaska. Her walls were covered with tracking maps, wildlife photographs, and complex ecological charts. She was direct and uncompromising. a scientist who had dedicated her entire career to understanding the complex behavioral patterns of Alaskan wildlife.
The bear that saved you wasn't just any bear.
She explained, spreading out a series of detailed research documents.
It was part of a unique genetic lineage we had been studying for years. A female Kodiak bear, designated as B427 in our research logs, had an extraordinary set of behavioral characteristics that made her unique.
The documents revealed a fascinating history. B427 had been observed displaying unusual problem-solving skills and what researchers described as an unprecedented level of environmental adaptation. She had been tracked since her early years, showing remarkable intelligence that went beyond typical bear behavior. Tommy learned that his rescue wasn't just a random act of animal instinct, but potentially the result of years of complex environmental and genetic research. The bear had been part of a long-term study examining how certain bear populations developed advanced survival strategies in extreme conditions.
Your survival wasn't just luck.
Dr. Rodriguez continued.
It was a confluence of multiple factors: the bear's unique behavioral patterns, the specific environmental conditions, and a series of circumstances that aligned in a way we've never fully understood.
The research suggested that B427 had a history of unusual interactions with human environments. Previous tracking data showed instances where she had approached human settlements not with aggression, but with a curious, almost calculated approach. She'd been observed protecting her cubs in ways that suggested a level of intelligence far beyond typical bear behavior. Tommy's own medical records from his childhood became part of the investigation. Doctors had always been puzzled by his remarkable recovery. Minimal frostbite, no long-term physical damage despite hours of exposure in sub-zero temperatures. Now, these medical anomalies began to make sense in the context of the research. Jack Holloway provided additional context. He had been part of the search and rescue team that found Tommy, and his own field notes revealed something extraordinary. The bear had remained near Tommy until the rescue team arrived, almost as if protecting him. This wasn't typical predator or prey behavior. This was something entirely different.
We've always known that bears are intelligent,
Jack explained during one of their many conversations.
but what we observed with B427 was something else entirely. She seemed to understand human vulnerability in a way we couldn't explain through traditional scientific models.
Genetic testing revealed another layer of complexity. B427 came from a unique lineage of bears that had been isolated in a specific region of Alaska, an area with unique environmental challenges. This isolation had potentially created a distinct genetic variation that enhanced survival skills. Tommy's own background became part of the investigation. His parents, it turned out, had been environmental researchers themselves, a detail he had never fully appreciated until now. Could there have been some deeper, almost inexplicable connection between his family's work and this particular bear? As the weeks of research continued, Tommy realized this was more than just a story of survival. It was a profound exploration of the complex relationships between humans and wildlife, a narrative that challenged traditional understanding of animal behavior and intelligence. The revelation was overwhelming. Tommy wasn't just a survivor, he was potentially a key piece in understanding a complex ecological puzzle that scientists had been trying to solve for decades.
We're just beginning to understand what happened.
Dr. Rodriguez said, her eyes gleaming with scientific excitement.
And you, Tommy, are at the center of something truly extraordinary.
Dramatic, life-changing moment. The call came on a crisp October morning, unexpected and jarring. Tommy was in his office at the Environmental Research Center in Anchorage, reviewing satellite tracking data for a wolf conservation project when his phone vibrated. The number was unfamiliar, with a remote Alaskan area code that immediately caught his attention.
Tommy Reyes?
The voice was gravelly, laden with years of outdoor exposure and hard living.
Yes, who is this? Name's Marcus Holloway. I'm Jack's son. We need to talk about something that happened years ago, something that involves you, the bear that saved you, and a secret that's been buried for decades.
Tommy's hand froze over his computer mouse. The mention of the bear immediately heightened his senses. Since his research with Dr. Rodriguez, He'd become obsessed with understanding the extraordinary circumstances of his childhood survival. Marcus explained that he was a wildlife conservation officer who had recently uncovered documents from his father's private collection, papers that had been hidden away for years. These weren't just routine research notes, but something far more complex and potentially dangerous.
Meet me at the old ranger station outside Denali National Park,
Marcus said.
Come alone and tell no one.
The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. 2 days later, Tommy's rugged SUV navigated the treacherous mountain roads. The landscape was familiar yet alien, the same wilderness that had nearly claimed his life decades ago. The old ranger station stood as a weathered sentinel, its wooden structure barely holding together against decades of harsh Alaskan winters. Marcus Holloway was not what Tommy expected. A tall, lean man in his late 50s, with eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the wilderness. His hands were calloused, marked by years of outdoor work. He carried a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had traveled through multiple lifetimes.
What I'm about to tell you will change everything you understand about your survival.
Marcus began, spreading out a series of documents on an old wooden table. The papers revealed a complex narrative that went far beyond a simple bear rescue. Tommy learned that B427, the bear that saved him, was part of a classified research project investigating animal behavior in extreme environmental conditions. But this wasn't just scientific research. There were hints of something more: government involvement, experimental tracking programs, and potential ecological manipulation. Marcus's father, Jack, had been more than just a search and rescue worker. He was a key researcher in a project that studied how certain animal populations could be tracked and potentially guided to interact with human environments in specific ways.
Your rescue wasn't an accident.
Marcus explained, his voice dropping to a near whisper.
It was a carefully orchestrated event that was part of a much larger ecological experiment.
The documents suggested that B427 had been part of a specialized tracking program. Her movements, interactions, and behavioral patterns had been meticulously documented. Tommy's childhood rescue was potentially a controlled experiment in understanding interspecies communication and survival strategies. But there was more. Additional research indicated that Tommy's parents, both environmental researchers, might have been inadvertently involved in this project. Their own research aligned suspiciously well with the tracking data of B427.
We're talking about a multi-decade research initiative that challenges everything we understand about wildlife behavior.
Marcus continued.
Your survival was a key data point in this research.
Tommy's mind reeled. What had seemed like a miraculous childhood survival was potentially a carefully constructed scientific scenario. The bear that saved him wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. It was part of a complex research program. Marcus produced a final document, a confidential report that suggested the research had broader implications. It wasn't just about understanding bear behavior, but about developing strategies for human survival in extreme environments.
The government wanted to understand how certain animal populations could be studied and potentially guided to interact with human environments.
Marcus explained.
Your rescue was a critical moment in that research.
The implications were staggering. Tommy's entire understanding of his childhood, his survival, and his connection to the wilderness was being fundamentally rewritten. As the afternoon light filtered through the ranger station's dusty windows, Tommy realized his life was about to change forever. The story of a boy saved by a bear was transforming into something far more complex. A narrative of scientific manipulation, ecological research, and human-animal interaction that challenged everything he thought he knew.
What happens now?
Tommy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Marcus's response was measured, calculated.
Now we decide what truth gets told and what remains hidden.
Resolution and personal transformation. The revelation from Marcus Holloway had set in motion a chain of events that would fundamentally alter Tommy Reyes's understanding of his own existence. In the months following their meeting at the old ranger station, he found himself torn between scientific curiosity and a deep-seated need for personal closure. His work at the Environmental Research Center took on a new dimension. Every satellite image, every wildlife tracking report now carried a potential hidden meaning. Tommy began to dig deeper, using his professional credentials to access restricted databases and cross-reference the documents Marcus had shared. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, his longtime mentor and the only person he partially trusted with fragments of his discovery, became his confidant. She had always been more than just a colleague. She understood Tommy's unique connection to wilderness survival in a way few others could.
This goes beyond typical research.
Tommy explained during one late-night conversation in her cluttered office. Stacks of ecological journals and tracking maps surrounded them.
We're talking about a systematic approach to understanding animal-human interactions that challenges everything we know about ecological boundaries.
Elena listened carefully, her decades of research providing a critical lens.
The implications are enormous.
She murmured.
If what you're suggesting is true, we're looking at a research program that could revolutionize our understanding of survival strategies.
Tommy's personal transformation wasn't just intellectual, it was deeply emotional. The bear that saved him as a child was no longer just a miraculous survivor story. B427 represented a complex being with a carefully documented history, a participant in a larger scientific narrative. He began tracking down additional information about the bear. Through a network of wildlife researchers and park rangers, Tommy discovered that B427 had been part of a specialized research group tagged in the late 1980s. Her movements had been meticulously documented, her interactions with human environments carefully studied. The research suggested that certain bears, particularly in the Alaskan wilderness, were being observed for their adaptive capabilities. B427 wasn't just an individual animal, but a key subject in understanding how large predators might interact with human environments under extreme conditions. As winter approached, Tommy made a decision that would define his personal and professional trajectory. He would return to the exact location where he had been rescued decades ago, not as a victim or a survivor, but as a researcher seeking understanding. The expedition was carefully planned. With Eleanor's support and Marcus Holloway's additional research, Tommy assembled a small team of wildlife experts. They would spend 2 weeks in the remote Alaskan wilderness, retracing the path of B427 and documenting the ecological conditions that had made his childhood survival possible. The journey was grueling. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Advanced tracking equipment, thermal imaging cameras, and comprehensive geological mapping tools accompanied them. Tommy carried with him the original documents Marcus had shared, along with his own meticulously compiled research. On the 7th night of their expedition, during a particularly harsh snowstorm, something extraordinary happened. While reviewing tracking data in their insulated research tent, Tommy discovered a pattern in B427's historical movement that aligned perfectly with his own rescue decades earlier.
It wasn't random.
He told Elena, his voice trembling with excitement.
Every movement, every interaction was part of a carefully documented research strategy.
The implications were profound. The bear hadn't just randomly saved a child. It had been part of a sophisticated research program studying interspecies survival strategies. Tommy's rescue was potentially a controlled experiment in understanding how large predators might interact with human environments under extreme survival conditions. As their expedition concluded, Tommy knew his life had irrevocably changed. He was no longer just a survivor with an incredible story. He had become a bridge between human understanding and the complex world of wilderness survival. Upon returning to Anchorage, he began preparing a comprehensive research paper. With Eleanor's guidance, he carefully documented his findings, ensuring that the sensitive nature of the research was presented scientifically and ethically. The paper would challenge existing paradigms about wildlife research, human-animal interactions, and survival strategies. It wasn't just an academic document. It was a testament to the complex, interconnected nature of ecological systems. Marcus Holloway, who had initially shared the documents, became an unexpected ally. Together they worked to ensure that the sensitive information was presented responsibly, protecting both the research subjects and the broader scientific community. Tommy's personal transformation was complete. A scared child who had been saved by a bear had become a respected researcher, bridging the gap between human understanding and the complex world of wilderness survival. As he looked out over the Alaskan landscape from his research center office, Tommy understood that some stories are bigger than individual experiences. They are part of a larger, more intricate narrative of survival, research, and the profound connections that exist between humans and the natural world. His journey was just beginning.